right, so in today's video, we're going to be talking about, did World War II destroy European colonial rule in Africa? Now, we already spoke about the effects of World War I on colonial rule, and we start to see the rumblings of independence movements where people are beginning to want to demand more rights, demand more independence, were upset that they didn't get those greater rights like we talked about with Egypt. And now we're going to see it all kind of come to a head now after World War II. So the first question is, how did World War II lead to the growth of nationalism in Africa? Now, we already know that most of Africa comes under European control right before World War I. If we think about the Berlin Conference again, that's 1884. And that's really not that far before World War I starts in 1914. The pre-colonial, the prior to Africa, the continent of Africa becoming colonies, there were a lot of missionaries there who had created Western style schools. So there was a basis of Western educated elite. And like we saw in India, it's going to be those Western educated elite that are really going to lead these independence movements, even though during World War I, they had been loyal to their European mother countries. However, during World War I, and then again, we're going to see this pattern in World War II, the colonies are going to be used for troops. They're going to be used for supplies. The way that they acquired these troops was through forced conscription. Remember, I had said that in class. So as a result, there was a lot of uprisings against this, against being forced to fight for a war that you have nothing to do with, against having to have all your food taken away, again, to be given to troops for a war that you have nothing to do with. So overall, the economy was badly hurt, excuse me. And then, of course, after World War I, you have the Great Depression. And a lot of the goods that were being produced in Africa, which were more like cash crops or luxury items, are not being bought. For instance, like cocoa. Like cocoa was a major crop that was produced in like West Africa and countries like Ghana. Obviously, during the Great Depression, people aren't buying chocolate. So that meant that their economies really suffered during the course of that Great Depression period. Now, the Europeans kept very few of the promises that they made to get the people in Africa to support them in the war. Promised them better jobs, didn't get that. Promised them public honors for those troops returning home, they didn't get that. In the French colonies in particular, opportunities for political organization or protest were restricted. So kind of like what we see in India with the Rowlatt Act, where people were not allowed to meet and gather and protest. We see a similar type of thing happening in France. So as a result, this just kind of leads to more strikes and more rebellions. It becomes a cycle. Again, with World War II, many of these people had fought in World War II, and then when returned home, they're continuing to be treated inferior. So they went and they fought. Some of their friends died fighting for a cause. They come back home, and their European colonial rulers are still treating them as if they are inferior. And this really angered people. The other issue was, once India gets its independence, it's like the same thing in the Western Hemisphere. Once the United States got their independence, that became the model that many of the Latin American countries are going to follow. So same thing is going to happen here. Once India gets its independence, this encouraged many Africans to fight for their independence. And the other major thing that World War I compounded then with World War II. The Europeans tried to phrase the reason why they should be controlling these people in Africa is because they are the superior race. They are the ones that are going to civilize them. Think about like the white man's burden. Well, now all of a sudden, not all of a sudden, but now since in the wake of World War I and World War II, where the Europeans have been slaughtering themselves over pretty minor things, they kind of lose that moral argument anymore, especially in the wake of the Holocaust. They have no right to say that they are the superior civilization if they just spent decades slaughtering each other. And so there was a feeling amongst a lot of people that Western civilization really was coming to an end in the wake of World War I and then compounded with World War II. So that takes us to this question. How did these African nations actually gain their independence? So the British colonies, as I have here, were some of the first to seek independence. And there was a couple of reasons about that. First, the British felt very hypocritical about colonialism. Some of the people in Britain were like, we just fought this war to free people from you know, Nazi domination, it's really kind of wrong for us then to be continuing to control, people in other parts of the world. The war left her really weak and unable to afford the colonies. This is when we start to see the rise of the social welfare state in Western Europe, where, health insurance and education and all these things are being provided for to the people, because in the wake of the Great Depression and all those issues. So that becomes very expensive, and the colonies are very expensive. So if you're going to be able to pay for things, you got to be able to cut somewhere. So they decided in large part that they're going to start cutting their colonies. Also, like I said previously, a new African educated middle class begins to emerge, and they're going to begin to kind of become cohesive in fighting back against European rule. So now Ghana was the first state to gain their independence. So Ghana, when it was a British colony, was referred to as the Gold Coast. You can guess why it was called the Gold Coast. When they get their independence, they decide to take the name Ghana to kind of go back to the idea of the Western African trading states like Ghana, Mali, and Songhai. That's why there's also a country of Mali today. So now, Kwame Nkrumah was really the leader who helped to bring Ghana to independence from the British. He had been educated abroad. He studied in the US and he studied in London. He was a school teacher. He preached nonviolence. He had a lot of connections with people like Dr. Martin Luther King. And in fact, show you this picture here. There's Kwame Nkrumah with Dr. King. So there was this kind of like, he had that idea of nonviolence, similar also from Gandhi. So he used things like boycotts and strikes. But it was an uphill battle. It took about a good 10 years before they were ultimately successful in 1957. So in 1947, his position was the general secretary to the United Gold Coast Convention. And the United Gold Coast Convention was kind of like the INC. They were trying to figure out ways for them to gain independence from the British. So in 1948, he was falsely arrested. Police had fired on a protest. It was a protest by African ex-servicemen, so men who had fought in World War II, protesting the rising cost of living, and this tipped off a series of riots. The government suspected the United Gold Coast Convention to be the cause of it, and he was falsely arrested. Eventually, he wasn't in prison for that long. He then winds up traveling around the countryside trying to gain support for independence. In 1949, he forms the Convention People's Party. And then in 1950, he calls for positive action, civil disobedience, non-cooperation. And so this led to a huge amount of boycotts and strikes, and he was arrested again and sentenced to 3 years in prison. Now, what we start to see in Ghana was that there was, or in what was then the Gold Coast, there was just too much protest, international protest, internal resistance, and the British decide that it's just better for them to leave the Gold Coast. So in 1951, we have its first election. And 1957, we had the first election because on March 6, 1957, Ghana becomes an independent nation. And Nkrumah is actually elected president while he's still in prison, is when he actually gets elected. Now, Ghana, unfortunately, still needs to modernize. And unfortunately, we'll talk about this a little bit later, which is a problem that a lot of these new nations in Africa kind of wind up facing, is Nkrumah, even though he comes in with these very noble intentions, wanting to modernize the country, there was just too many pressures and a lot of obstacles, and he winds up over time becoming very authoritarian, and eventually he's ousted from power. So we don't see, a complete success story for many of these former colonies in Africa. So the next country we're going to move on to talking about is Kenya. So Kenya is another British colony. Kenya is in East Africa, so whereas Ghana was in West Africa, Kenya was in East Africa. And so the deal with Kenya, though, Kenya is a little bit different than Ghana. Kenya has very fertile land. The Great Rift Valley is in Kenya. And so there is a lot of fertile land in Kenya. So as a result, there was a much higher settlement of British into Kenya than we see in places like Ghana. So as a result, we see a situation where the Kenyans were pretty much like pushed off of the best lands in favor of the um, in favor of the British settlers. So we see almost similar, not as extreme as what we're going to see in South Africa, but we definitely see a similar type of trend like we do see in South Africa. So as a result, the war or the movement for independence in Kenya is a little bit more violent than we see in a lot of the other African nations. So there was a terrorist group formed called the Mau Maus, Maumau, and they kind of work against the British, and they employ some forms of terrorism, which led to the British kind of wanting to very quickly kind of pull out of Kenya, even though um, most of the people that were targeted were actually Kenyans who had supported the British and not necessarily the British themselves. They still pretty much pulled out. But you can see from some of these writings here, some of the attitudes that we start to see developing. This idea of like the British saw this as a place where they could like easily make their money. They were pushing, like I said, the African people off of their land. And then they had all of these people that were forced to be their servants. So it was cheap to get servants. It was cheap to have lots of helpers. So these people coming from Britain could live a quality of life that they probably would not have been able to live back home in Britain. So if we look here, it says, after 1939 to 1945, war, that's World War II, things were changing. Our social and economic grievances were plainer to all, and there were many more educated Africans who were beginning to understand that the social system was not immutable. Most of all, this was happening amongst my own tribe, the Kikuyu. Normal political methods seemed to be getting nowhere. The young men of the tribe saw that a time of crisis was approaching when great suffering might be necessary in order to achieve what they believe. So the Kikuyu tribe is basically the main support base for the Mau Mau. Although the situation was dangerous, even in October of 1952, it was not so dangerous that could not have been put right by a few political concessions. But the government, the British, chose to answer it with a series of the harshest and most brutal measures ever taken against the native people in the British Empire in the 20th century. And so the movement developed by action and reaction into a full-scale rebellion involving the souls of my people. And so here you can see like a quote from a white policeman in Kenya. He says, it was a war to save white civilization in Kenya, and in war, people get killed. And here's British soldiers stopping and searching African suspects that are suspected of possibly being Mau Maus. And so it says here, this is from the point of view of Mau Mau, some settlers hired other Africans to do their killing for them. The practice of paying Wanderbo hunters 20 shillings for every presumed Mau Mau they killed became so open that it was reported in the United States press. So what the British were doing is they were hiring other tribal groups to go after the Kikuyu tribe, which was mostly suspected of being Mau Mau. Other whites did their own exterminating. Several professional hunters began to stalk Kikuyu just as they would some relatively dangerous game. One hunter, who was not usually given to braggadocio, bragging, said he killed more than 100 Kikuyu whom he thought to be Mau Mau, although he admitted that his policy of shooting first and asking questions later made it very difficult to be certain. So you could see as the Mau Maus were pushing back against the British responded very brutally, taking away civil rights, just killing anyone they even suspected of possibly being members of that organization. And basically people were kind of pushed into concentration camp like organizations. And so here are British troops looking for Mau Mau suspects, and they were stopping and checking people at gunpoint and looking at their paperwork. So it says, and you can kind of see from here kind of the attitude that the British had towards them. So under a section discussing the handling of African trackers assigned to army units, it read, the African is simple, not very intelligent, but willing if treated in the right way. Do not regard him as a slave or an equal. You will find that most Africans have an innate respect for the white man. So again, you can see this racist attitude that the British had towards their colonial people. And here you could see this is a song, a patriotic song, kind of the Mau Mau people kind of expressing their anger and upset over years of British domination. So no African can sleep because lack of adequate food. We shall be happy when we get our land back. In great unity, the Kenyan people truly united. Let us now throw off this colonial yoke off our backs so that we can find open fields in which to work and play. We shall be very happy when our oppressors are forced to agree that we are the masters of this land. Today they call us boys because they pretend not to know who we are. Our fertile land was taken from us. We were forced into desert land, and still they continue to treat us as if an African has no blood in his veins. So the Kenyans gained their independence in 1963. So 5 years after, or 6 years after Ghana in 1957. The leader of that movement was a man named Jomo Kenyatta, and he provided very strong leadership. And he eventually becomes the president of Kenya, the first president of Kenya. So here you can see this is Kenyan Independence Day. So the Duke of Edinburgh standing beside Kenyatta as British control is no longer going to be part of Kenya anymore. So a couple other countries to talk about, even though I don't have such nice slides about them, but I'll talk about them anyway. So we already talked about the Congo. So I'll just go back and kind of remind you a little bit about the Congo and their fight for independence. So the Congo, as we already know, was a source of a source of rubber, but also a source of diamonds, coffee, copper, and they even had about 70% of the world's cobalt. So even though when we talked about imperialism with the Congo, we focused a lot on rubber, there was many other goods that the Congo was producing. And so basically, the Congo gets its independence in 1960, and it all happens very quickly. There was anti-government rioting that began in January of 1959, and by January of 1960, the Belgians were agreeing to give them their independence, and the Congo gained independence on June 30th, 1960. Now, if you remember, also, there were different groups that were kind of jockeying for power in the Congo. Because even if you remember from that video we saw in class, there are tons of different ethnic groups within the Congo, different tribal groups, and they're all kind of in some ways fighting with each other. So one of the major leaders was Joseph Kasavubu, Kasavubu. And he was an advocate for independence, but he was focusing on his group of people, the Bakongo, Bakongo. And then you have Patrice Lumumba. Remember, we read his speech that he made when the Congolese got their independence, but Lumumba spelled Lumumba. And he wanted to see a more national leadership of the Congo. He wanted to see the Congo as one country. But like I said, when the Congolese get their independence on June 30th, 1960, the Belgians did not really prepare the Congo to function as an independent state. There was about 4,000 administrative forces posts that needed to be fulfilled. I think you can probably hear my dog barking. But there was only 30 university graduates in the whole country. So Lumumba becomes the new prime minister, and he makes that speech that kind of expresses some of the great deal of rage that the Congolese people had towards the Belgians. I'll quote some of the speech for you. He says, "We are no longer your monkey. We have known the backbreaking works extracted from us in exchange for salaries, which permit us neither to eat enough to satisfy our hunger, nor dress or lodge ourselves decently, nor to raise our children as the beloved creatures they are. We have known mockery, insults, the blows submitted morning, noon, and night because we were black. We have known that our lands were despoiled in the name of supposedly legal text, which in reality only recognized the rights of the stronger. And finally, who will forget the hangings or the firing squads where so many of our brothers perished, or the cells into which we were brutally thrown, those who escaped their soldiers' bullets, the soldiers whom the colonists made the instruments of their denomination." So we also know that pretty much within days of independence, there are many mutinies. Kasavubu dismisses Lumumba. Lumumba dismisses Kasavubu. So they're basically just firing each other. There was another leader, Tshombe, Tshombe. He was the leader of the Katanga region, Katanga. And the Katanga region was the richest region of the Congo. He declares Katanga independent from the rest of Congo, and he actually was supported by the Belgians. Both Kasavubu and Lumumba did not agree with the succession of the Katanga region, so they both went to the UN for help. Lumumba wanted a UN peacekeeping force to bring Katanga back to the Congo, and Kasavubu didn't. So now you have the prime minister and the president kind of disagreeing over what should happen, so really the UN can't do anything. So Lumumba, in his kind of frustration, looked to the USSR for help. As a result, he was kind of seen as a communist in the nature of in the background of the Cold War. So he's captured by Kasavubu. He escapes. He's recaptured. He's turned over to Katanga sectionists. He's then murdered with the help of the Belgians and the CIA, RCIA. Ultimately, the UN forces defeated Katanga in 1963. The provinces revolted against the central government and were helped put down by a group of European mercenary troops. But Tshombe, surprisingly, winds up becoming the prime minister of the whole Congo. But then he is pretty much quickly overthrown in a military coup led by Joseph Mobutu. If you remember that whole long name, Mobutu Sese Seko something something, and he goes on about the warrior that breathes fire in the wake. But he's basically just known as Mobutu, Mobutu. So when Joseph Mobutu comes to power, he had help from Morocco, from the French, from the United States, and he ruled essentially as a dictator. He changes the name of the country from Congo to Zaire. Today it's back to Congo. He transferred wealth from Congo's exports to his own accounts. So while the people were suffering and infrastructure was falling apart, he had about $4 to $5 billion in the bank. He's ultimately forced from office and goes into exile in 1997. And so we see even today now the Congo is still in a series of amazingly brutal civil war with all these various different sectional groups. The whole infrastructure of the country has pretty much fallen apart as a result of mismanagement and poor leaders trying to rule the country. Now, the last region we're going to talk about, and I don't have any more slides about it, but is Algeria. Now, Algeria is a French colony. Algeria is in North Africa. It's right on the Mediterranean coast, and it's actually the largest European settler colony in North Africa. There's about 1 million French who live in North Africa, who live in Algeria, and they make up about 12% of the population, and they own disproportionately more land. They own a third of the land. So the colony of Algeria was an integral part of France. It has constitutional representation in the National Assembly in France, and the Algerian elite were French educated and really kind of identified with themselves and saw themselves as French. Also, during World War II, it's going to be a very important place for the French resistance because the leader of the French army, a man by the name of Charles de Gaulle, who eventually becomes president of Algeria, he is exiled in Algeria, and that's where he really kind of launches some of the resistance movements against Nazi control during World War II. But in the 1940s, we start to see reformists begin to grow in Algeria, and an Arab Islamic nationalism begin to grow that begin to identify themselves with other Arabs throughout North Africa. So in the mid-1950s, we see a revolution begin in Algeria led by a group called the National Liberation Front. Now, the violence grew so bad, it spread to France, it almost led to a civil war. It's going to lead to the fall of the Fourth Republic in France because basically they kind of like lost control. But eventually, a settlement was negotiated and Algeria gets its independence in 1962. Now, this was the war that had been fought, though, throughout most of the 50s and into the 60s was incredibly brutal. About 300,000 Algerians died, 20,000 French were killed, and many of the French that lived in Algeria leave Algeria and go back to France. There was only about 7,000 people in high school in the whole country in 1954. Only 70 people had a college education. So we see a similar problem that we see in the Congo in that the people are not educated in a way that they are able to take on this job of running the country. But the new leaders were hardened by years of war. They wanted a centralized government. In 1956, Oil was discovered in Algeria, which allowed them to have the revenue to fund industrialization. And we see many migrants begin coming into the cities. And we also see hundreds of thousands of Algerians immigrating to France. So many of France's Muslim population today are Algerian immigrants. So the last question, we're going to ask today is how did the newly independent states try to create national unity? Because there was ideas of trying to create one big, like, country to kind of, not country, but organization so that the various different countries could cooperate together. So the leaders of independent Africa, these independent African nations, were mostly Western educated, and a lot of them had Western ideas. A lot of them were influenced by African Americans like Marcus Garvey, like W.E.B. Du Bois, and they really wanted to create a democratic or socialist leaning government, but they wanted to maintain the colonial boundaries. And that creates a very large problem because if we look at a country like the Congo, it has 200 different territorial groups and there's 75 different languages spoken in the Congo. So it's not necessarily so easy to kind of create a unity movement. But Nkrumah of Ghana and Jomo Kenyatta of Kenya actually pushed for a movement that they referred to as Pan-Africanism because they felt that African unity should extend beyond the borders of the various different countries. And in 1963, we see the creation of the Organization of African Unity. And they believed in a distinctive African personality. And it was developed in response to Western racial superiority theories. And so they also kind of emphasized their pre-colonial history, and that their societies were, had worth, where the Europeans kind of just disregarded the culture and the societies that these people had formed previously. But we do see, even today, there's an organization called the African Union, and many of the countries in Africa today are starting to recover from kind of years of colonial damage. And the African Union is a pretty strong organization at trying to kind of, solve the problems that the region is facing. So here you see that slide again with Kenyatta and Ghana. Nkrumah and Dr. Martin Luther King. But so there's this other movement called the Negritude movement, which is a literary movement that's trying to express everything that I just kind of mentioned. This idea of trying to bring and emphasize the culture of all these various different places in Africa, to kind of combat that racism that the Europeans have kind of like imposed upon this continent for so many centuries. So why would World War II lead to the independence of Africa? I want you to think about that as we end this video. Thanks, guys.